Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Royal Society Centre for History of Science. My name is Peter Collins, I'm the director of the Centre, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all, those who've been here many times and those who are here for the first time, and to introduce today's speaker, George Hemmen. George is quite a special chap. He's worked out, I'm deeply envious really, because he's worked out how to have a terrific career going all over the world to really nice places and being paid for it. And I've often thought, if only I could work out how to do it. You probably have to be fit and strong and healthy and stuff like that, but there's a drawback. But George, first of all, went down to Antarctica in the early mid-1950s, before it was fashionable, and thought this was so much fun he wanted to stay there. So he contrived to get the Royal Society wanting to do something and the Falklands Islands government wanting to help them. And he, being down there and knowing his way around the place, got given the job. So he was working for the Royal Society from 1955 onwards. He was then employed by the Royal Society from 1959 onwards, and ended up creating the expeditions office at the Society, and then starting with the International Geophysical Year, and ran the expeditions office and thought, well, Antarctica's great, but it's cold, and he's been there a few times already, so he then found some warmer places to go to, and had a terrific time here, and that's what he's going to be talking about. George, as I said, retired from here in 1985, so I overlapped him by 4 years, to give a bit of autobiography. So, George, you have the floor, and we're looking forward very much to your talk.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you very much for that introduction, Peter. It's nice to be back in this building, which I visit from time to time, but last time I was here regularly was, as you say, 1985. Now, Peter's introduction told you really what I was going to talk to you about today, which is the Royal Society expeditions really in the second half of the 20th century rather than what this title suggests. There were some expeditions in the earlier part of the century, but they weren't Royal Society expeditions in the same sense that they were run by and from, well, Burlington House as it was then, or this building in later years. So the first one, where are we here? It all started in about 1955. The Treasury funding was approved for the International Geophysical Year. Now, the International Geophysical Year was essentially the first really big international, multinational research program run under the auspices of the International Council for Scientific Unions, which is now called the International Council for Science. But the IGY was to span January 56, well, no, the actual observation period was going to be mid-1957 through to the end of 1958. This was a worldwide program, some 60-odd nations taking part, and the planning, of course, was very carefully organized, starting in about 1952. Something like 12 nations had committed themselves to either running, continuing, or building new stations in the Antarctic. And, of course, this then enabled the planning people to identify gaps in the coverage, because the polar regions were very, very important when it comes to studying the geophysical processes affecting the Earth. And one major gap was in the southern part of the Weddell Sea. There we go. This area, now the whole of this area is usually covered in very, very heavy ice, which is quite impenetrable. The Falkland Islands Dependency Survey did operate in this part of the territory, so they were participating, but the Royal Society said, okay, we'll see if we can put a station up down here. As I said, Treasury funding for the whole program was approved in August of 1955, and that left us with just 3 months to plan a major expedition to put in the main living hut for the main program, because it was quite impossible to say, okay, we'll go in January of 1957 and have everything up and running by the middle of that year. It couldn't be done. So a little ship was chartered, a little Norwegian sealing ship was chartered, and here we are in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, on the way south, leaving Southampton 22nd of September of that year. Here we are, idyllic conditions, relaxing for about 3, 4, 5 weeks. But as you get a bit further south, then things get a little bit rougher. But you can see how all this cargo on the deck, that rope was the lifeline, because the accommodation was up in the front of the ship, and they had to get back there to get their meals. Not very comfortable. But you hit some, I've lost my map now, but anyway, you go through a belt of pack ice, and then you come into this wonderful shore lead, and you've got something like 700 or 800 miles. You're sailing down this shore lead with these ice cliffs on the side here. They're about 90 to 100 feet high. But as you get further south, down to about, this was round about 76 and a half south, you start to run into some really bad ice. And, well, that was quite fortunate, because this was a sealing ship, so we had fresh meat for dinner. But the only way out was to get over the side and dig the ship out. I don't think health and safety would allow you to do that these days, but there we are, that's another thing. But eventually we did find a landing at 75.5 degrees south. Well, tried 2 or 3 places first of all, but eventually found what looked a likely place, and there were the 3 of us who had been in the south before formed a reconnaissance party which had to go up and try and find a site, and that's the 3 of us when we said, right, this is it, this is where the station will be. This was about 1.5 miles in from the coast. There you are, there's the ship unloading on the ice edge, and that, as I say, is 90 to 100 feet high of the ice. Just some quick pictures of the unloading. You're unloading onto sea ice, and you get all these cracks, and you just have to build bridges and hope for the best. Now, this was the foundation of the hut, the main living hut for the main expedition, 128 foot long. It's a big, big building. These are just the timbers to support the thing, and for about 3 or 4 months, well, less than that, they were going to be living in tents while they built the hut. This was for the advance party. After we started this, a few weeks later, Sir Vivian Fuchs came through that area on his ship, the Totten, and left a couple of husky pups as pets, because they wouldn't have been any good as sledge dogs. By about April, they'd managed to get the main frame of the hut. It's quite a place, isn't it? And they just managed to enclose the end of it, so they were able to move in and at least get out of those not very comfortable tents. The following year, we shared a vessel, shared the Magadan, which is that red one, with the Transantarctic expedition, but there was so much cargo, we only had half the ship's space. We had to charter the Totten again to carry the rest of it. There we are. There's a couple of nice pictures of us unloading. There we are. That's the 2 ships there. That is the main party of the IGY expedition, just sort of lined up for a photograph before we left them behind. This is a picture of that hut 1 year on. January of 1957. By the Magadan left, leaving them on the ice they were going to be there for 2 winters. The ship was going down to relieve them mid-term, but they were there for 2 years. That is a picture of the hut 2 years on. They were, the only way in and out was through the roof. And eventually the Totten went down again to take them home, and there we are. The next thing that happened was at the latter part of 1958, it was the centenary of the publication of Charles Darwin's paper on Origin of Species, and the Royal Society decided that as part of their celebration, they would send an expedition to the southern parts of Chile where Darwin worked, not just, receptions and parties, actually do something positive, and sent this expedition down there. The object of it was to look at the similarities between the plants and animals between the southern parts of South America and the South Island of New Zealand. So it was a small 5-man party, and they visited 3 places: the island of Chiloé, which is up here somewhere. Where are we? Down here. Puerto Eden down here, and the very southernmost tip of South America, which was Navarino Island. They were in the field for about 4 or 5 months. It's quite successful. There was a discussion meeting at the Royal following that. Oh, I should have told you, by the way, if I can just go back to the Antarctica. I forgot to mention that. The results of the Royal Society expedition were published in 4 massive volumes. There we go. Chris Argent over there was the editor of 3 of these. It's quite some task. I don't think you publish things like this anymore, do you?
Almost certainly on the web.
Yeah, almost certainly on the web. Anyway, sorry about that. So anyway, the discussion meeting the discussion meeting was really on the southern cold temperate zone as a whole, not focusing entirely and solely on southern Chile. And one of the results of that was that there was so much more work in the biological field to be done throughout the southern hemisphere that a proposal was made to the Royal Society to establish a long-term study. The first thing was to set up a scientific expeditions advisory committee, because of course with these 2 the big Antarctic one and this smaller one, the experience that had been gained was considered to be quite unique, and it would be a pity to lose it. So there was this advisory committee, advisory service set up, and a new expeditions department. Right, that was fine, but don't forget the timing of this was 1959. Nothing very much happened because 1960 was the tercentenary year, and everything Royal Society was focused on the tercentenary. But come 1961, the government of North Borneo, which was then a British colony, was conscious of the increasing timber extraction that was going on in their territory, and they wanted to be sure to preserve some of it, and they wanted to establish a national park on Mount Kinabalu, which is about there, which is the highest peak between Australia and the Himalayas. And their idea was to establish a national park to protect everything above about 6,000 feet. Now, whether or not 6,000 feet was a realistic limit for such a venture was a bit questionable. So the Royal Society sent, in the government of North Borneo and the Royal Society collaborated in sending an expedition out there in 1961, and another one went out in 1964 at a different time of the year, and the objectives were quite clearly stated as being, where are we? There we are. To investigate present and planned tree felling and to make recommendations about the extent of a nature reserve. So that was the purpose of these two Royal Society expeditions, and a national park was established in 1964, covering something like 750 square kilometres. Now, I don't have much in the way of pictures, just a couple of these carnivorous plants, pitcher plants from North Borneo. Then 1965, again, this sort of arose in part from the discussion meeting on the southern cold temperate zone, although the Solomon Islands was hardly cold temperate, but it was all part of this southern hemisphere problem of trying to increase the knowledge of what was there. Now, again, in the Solomon Islands, there was increasing problems of timber extraction, and nobody really knew very much about the area. So the Royal Society, with the cooperation of the Royal Society of New Zealand, mounted a major expedition to the Solomon Islands. Now, the Solomon Islands, of course, are that group here. I've got a slightly larger scale of this. Now, we're talking about distances from here. What the expedition was really aimed to study a couple of areas here, Columbangra there, Santa Isabel here, and San Cristobal down there. The focus being on the altitudinal variations of plants and animals. But, of course, to get to these various islands, you're talking of a distance here about 150 miles, here about 250. There is no inter-island transport. There's only one town in that group, and the rest are just sort of scattered little villages in the islands. So we had to charter a ship to do this, and that meant that what was the ship going to be used for while the land party was going up these mountains? So this is just some of the porters carrying goods, camping equipment up. Now, can you just imagine, if you've got 10 scientists and you want to get up a high mountain with all their camping equipment, all their collecting equipment, then and all their food, then of course you need a team of porters. You have a team of porters, you need more food, you need more porters, and so it goes. But this is just what we did was to choose campsites, usually by a river. Now, don't forget, this is in the tropics, and one would normally say that that water would be undrinkable. But in the Solomon Islands, no, it was beautiful, fresh and beautiful, because of course there's hardly anybody living up in the hills. There you are, that's just a couple of the campsites, botanists working. Yes, that's one of the botanists collecting, that's one of he's a soil scientist. Up on the top of the mountains, this one's about 6,000-7,000 feet. Of course, you're in almost constant cloud, and you've got all this mossy forest, which is totally different from the lower areas. There you are, that's a nice little picture of the expedition ship, and fairly typical scenery of the whole of that area. Now, because we had a ship, because there was going to be times when it was just sitting around doing nothing, it was useful also to add a marine component to the expedition, and here they are working on the reefs and shallow waters and the lagoons, not on the same islands, but they had their own program. That was, I'll go back on that one. That resulted in a discussion meeting, major discussion meeting at the Royal, and the publication. I've got a list of the publications of all of these somewhere if anybody's interested afterwards. Now, before the Solomon Islands expedition was actually over in 1965, something else arose, which was this one. The Brazilian government had issued an invitation through various embassies in Brasilia for scientists to participate in a program to study the Amazonian rainforest. Now, come on. There we go. Where are we? I can't quite see. I can't read. Is that's Manaus up there?
Yeah.
All right, fine. And Brasilia is down here somewhere. Going on in Brasilia. Anyway, the plan was these roads didn't exist in those days. What had happened was from about here up to, well, all of this was completely unknown country. And the Brazilian government had started to drive a road through the virgin rainforest with the idea of connecting Brasilia, which is about here somewhere, with Manaus up on the Amazon, and in the long term, eventually, they hoped to join up with the Pan-American Highway. But what happened here was that the road had started out, the road building had started out, this is the forest that you're driving a road through. So you have to, they had to choose their route fairly carefully. The road building started off from a little tiny town called Xavantina, and there was nothing then for another 1,000 miles apart from forest until you got up to Manaus. And the Brazilian government, as I say, had invited various countries through their embassies to participate, to send scientists along with the road building party to at least catalogue what was there before it was all destroyed forever, because once you drive a road through, then everything changes. This is the little frontier town at the end of this is the house that was the Royal Society's base site. And it was very strange when you sort of arrive here after a weird sort of journey to suddenly find packing cases with the Royal Society expedition printed on the side of them. Now, come on, why is this not working? Help. Ah, good, thank you. I must apologise for my lack of technical ability. Anyway, you can see the start of this new road. This is the ferry across the celebrated Rio das Mortes, and it goes on. That road ran for about 200 miles when the Brazilian government suddenly stopped the funding. By this time, the Royal Society and the Royal Geographical Society together had agreed to send a rolling team of scientists. But what were you going to do now the road building wasn't going to happen? Well, by this time, it had got up to about 200 miles into this virgin forest, and in conjunction with the Brazil Academy of Sciences and the University of Brasilia, it was decided, well, the best thing to do is to consolidate all this. Let us build a good, if you like, research centre in the middle of this forest and run a 2-year study of the surrounding area, which is really what they did. That is the Royal Society, Royal Geographical Society base camp, about 170 miles up this new road in the heart of the virgin rainforest. There we are. There's the Brazilian flag, the Union flag, and in the middle, the Royal Society's flag. This is just a track through some of the lower area. Now, the next thing, we're still on this theme of tropical rainforest. By about, well, it got to about 1980, I think it was. There was a lot of concern about the whole issue of the recovery of tropical rainforest after disturbance. How much could you take out before it would recover? And the Royal Society Council agreed to set up a committee to see what could be done about this, and they came up with the idea that what was needed was collaboration with a country, preferably in the Far East, Philippines, Malaysia, North Borneo, where one could find a tract of virgin rainforest which the government was prepared to protect, where you could undertake some experimental studies. A small two-man reconnaissance party was sent out to the Far East. That was to Duncan Poore, who was the professor of forestry at Oxford, and myself, to talk to people out there and see what we could come up with. And the SABAH, which is North Borneo, of course, or was North Borneo, they said, well, look, they have established a forest reserve around here, not far from Mount Kinabalu, where we were working before, but about here. And they wanted to join a collaborative program with the Royal Society. And we're talking now about 1980. It took 4 years of planning before this actually took off the ground in any way. But interestingly, that program has been an amazing success story. It actually started, the Memorandum of Understanding, I think, was signed in late 1984, and the program actually initiated in mid-1985. And now Len's not here, is he? No. I was asking that because Len worked with me, and he was the one that took major responsibility for this one after 1985. So that program ran from 1985 to 2010. 25 years of Royal Society funding and support. It was based, here we are, here's the forest. I'm trying to show you that within this large nature reserve that the government had established, there was this DANUM Valley Research Station, and there it is, and that was where the whole program was focused. That was operated by the SABAH Foundation, and I found this a very fascinating concept, that the SABAH Foundation wanted to protect their forest because their function was for the good of the people of the country. And they had a lot of the timber concessions, but they didn't want to just strip the forest out, they wanted to make sure it regenerated. And so that was what all this was about. And this is still operating today. By the end of the by the end of the century, which is the period I'm talking about now, there were over 300 scientific papers published, 2 discussion meetings at the Royal Society, all from the program in that area. So there we are. That's some of the rainforest. One of the things now, moving to something quite different. In 1962, some of you may remember that the little island of Tristan da Cunha, which is about here somewhere, erupted unexpectedly, and the whole of the population had to be evacuated back to this country, because that's the island, a model of the island, sorry, not the island. That's the lava flow, and there's the only settlement. So there was no knowing where that was going. So the British government pulled that's in the wrong place, but no matter. The island population was evacuated, and there was one of the Navy ships was going down there in December, and so the Royal sent 2 scientists down to have a quick look, as a result of which a bigger expedition was planned for early in 1962, I think it was. But you can see how close the lava was to the settlement. And it was mainly geologists that were on this party, of course, but also a botanist and a zoologist to have a look at the effect of this eruption on the plants and animals, and also to see if there are any signs starting of recovery. Well, the advice from this expedition was of great help to the Foreign Office in deciding when, or if and when, the islanders could return. And they did eventually go back. But what was quite interesting was that as a result of the problems of getting funding to send this party out, the Royal Society set up a completely new scheme of things. It was almost a rapid response mechanism, that if there was an eruption, you could bypass the normal grant procedures and go through a couple of the offices and get somebody out there quickly. And it worked quite well, and some of the places that we're talking about, well, I've got a list here. Etna, of course, Soufriere in the Caribbean, Surtsey in Iceland, Agadir in Morocco, and even in conjunction with the British Antarctic Survey to Deception Island. We managed to get scientists out to these places almost as soon as we heard about the eruption. Of course, in the Caribbean, nowadays, they seem to have their own schemes of things, very much more than they did in those days. And even this recent Icelandic eruption, they really didn't need British scientists going out. They've got their own people. Okay, can we move on? Next thing that happened, 1966, the Ministry of Defence, in conjunction with the US Defence Department, decided they needed a staging point in the Indian Ocean, and the plan was to build an airstrip on the little island of ALDABRA, which is about here. Now, there had been an RAF station up at Gyan here in the Maldives up until about that time, but that of course was no longer possible. So the plan was to build this airstrip on ALDABRA. But the idea of destroying this little island, which was virtually unknown, apart from the fact that it was the only remaining natural breeding ground of the Indian Ocean giant tortoise, and had a vast breeding population of seabirds. So an expedition went out with the Ministry of Defence and Ministry of Works party to have a look at the place, and it was decided that we really had to send a whole series of expeditions, again, to gather as much information about the island as was possible before it was completely destroyed by building. Now, how you build an airstrip on that sort of stuff, I'm not quite sure. But there you are. That's the surface of it. But the defence people said, oh yes, we just pour concrete into it until it... Well, there you are, there's the surface of it. What happened... here's one of the tortoises. What happened was that in where are we? Yeah. In November of 1967, well, first of all, the officers of the Royal Society led the sort of protests about this planned development, and in the US, the National Academy of Sciences was doing the same thing with their defence people, but it didn't really have a lot of effect. Or did it? I don't know. Nobody really knows. But in November of 1967, 1967, the Ministry of Defence announced its withdrawal of commitments east of Suez. So there was no need now for developing this into an airfield, so it was once again preserved. But by this time, the scientific interest had been demonstrated quite clearly. They were weighing one of the giant tortoises. In the heat of the day, of course, they seek the shade of this, whatever they can find, otherwise they just boil. But because the interest had developed to such an extent, it was decided to build a semi-permanent research station so that British scientists and others could go there on a long-term basis. This is the Royal Society's research station, which started in... Now, when did I'm not quite sure. I'll give you a date if you like. No, I don't think I have a date when it actually was. Yes, it was the end of 1968 this was completed. So there we are, again, the research station with the Royal Society's flag flying, and the Seychelles became independent in 1976, and the operation and management of the research station was handed over to the Seychelles Islands Foundation in 1980. As far as I know, it's still operating. Next thing, another one, a slightly different field again, deep line fishing with coelacanth. This was a species of fish which was thought to be extinct, but then a specimen was taken around the Comores, and so there was a lot of interest. There was a lot of a big expedition was sent out, or a long-term expedition was sent out to fish on these deep slopes. That one was in 1969. 1969. They didn't actually find any coelacanth, but of course the knowledge of the deep slope fish fauna was really quite valuable. So, but later on, soon after that, another expedition was planned, this time to the Comores, and this was a British, French and American one, and they did indeed take 2 specimens of this fish, one on the point of death and the other one, there it is, once thought to be extinct. So, that seems to be the end of that. That's the end of my pictures, but what I'd like to say is that apart from these major expeditions, there are a number of other smaller operations that were sent around the place. Southern South America, there was a botanical transect across from about latitudes 46 south. There was a GeoTraverse in Tibet in 1985-86, which the Royal participated in. There were studies in Lake Baikal. None of these were called expeditions. They were called bilateral activities. In other words, the Royal was not taking the lead role in setting them up. So by about the 1990s, there wasn't any call now for any more of this kind of expeditionary activity. People were still going out to far-flung places, but mainly as individuals, individual projects or quite small projects, working as often as not within an overall activity such as the research station in DANUM Valley. So the expeditions department, I retired in 1985, and Len, who was working with me, moved to other duties, and the whole thing just quietly faded away. But what happened since then? Well, I'd like to just finish up by telling you something about some other interesting overseas activities in which the Royal participated in those years. The first of these was the International Indian Ocean Expedition of 1985 to 1959 to 1965. This was the first really big multinational oceanographic study of an oceanic area, and the Indian Ocean was chosen because it was the least known. And this country participated. There was the brand new Royal Research Ship Discovery, and two of Her Majesty's survey vessels, HMS Owen and HMS Dalrymple, all participated in this program, which had some quite striking results. I mean, it was from the Indian Ocean Expedition, really, that the concept of seafloor spreading was once and for all finally proven to be correct. And that was the people up in Cambridge as much as anywhere. Another thing that happened was that in 1983-84, there was a lot of concern about the effects of the emissions of sulphurous and nitrous gases from our power stations were having on the freshwater fisheries in Scandinavia. So, with financial support from the then Central Electricity Generating Board and the National Coal Board, the Royal Society, in conjunction with the National Academy of Sciences of Swedish National Academy of Sciences and the Norwegian Academy of Science and Letters, set up a 5-year program of research into the acidification of the surface waters of Scandinavia, which was incredibly successful, and that resulted in, the installation of flue gas cleaning and all that sort of thing. But that was a major Royal Society initiative at the time. More latterly, the Royal Society, in conjunction with the Royal Geographical Society, sent an expedition out to the Indian Ocean again. This one was to study the Mascarene Plateau. It's in the southern part of the Indian Ocean, and that again resulted in a discussion meeting and a publication of results. So anyway, there we are. That's how are we doing for time? Fine. Okay. That then is a brief overview of the expeditionary activities of the Royal Society in the second half of the 20th century. And before closing, I would just like to thank, is Jo here? No, she's not. Jo Hopkins. Yes, she is. Jo at the back there, in conjunction with my wife Margot, for putting all these slides onto this PowerPoint, far beyond my capability. And as you can gather, a lot of those earlier slides were more than 50 years old. Not bad. Thank you, both of you. Thank you very much.
That sounds a good question.